This video's making the rounds right now. Over 5 million views on Twitter, probably more on TikTok. Here's the caption. TikToker is going viral by telling illegal immigrants how to invade homes in America thanks to progressive squatting laws. The video's not in English, so I'll just read out the translation, fixing some of the grammatical errors. I have thought about invading a house in the United States. I found out that there's a law that says if a house is not inhabited, we can seize it. Guys, here in the United States, this also applies to land invasion, and I think that will be my next business, invading abandoned houses. I have looked for some codes with my African friends, and they've told me they've already taken about 7 houses, and as the saying goes, Daddy, you have to look for the return, and the return right now is to invade houses, so we are not in a street situation. And this is the only way we have, not to live in the street and not be a public burden. The law says that the abandoned houses that are deteriorated and that are in a bad condition, we can take, repair, and live in it, and if we can, sell it. We can even get credit on it. I would like to point out how angry looking and angry sounding this guy is. I'm sure my polite Canadian voice didn't do him credit.
Mi gente, he pensado invadir una casa en United States.
As I said, this video is blowing up on right-wing Twitter right now. Everyone over there is up in arms, and fair enough. This is happening in the larger context of the crisis at the southern border, illegal immigrants showing up like crazy, the feds in Texas squabbling over how to police it, that one very dramatic video a few days back of a crowd of immigrants overrunning border patrol. The right is very tuned in to illegal immigrant issues right now, and frankly, so are the normies. If there's one big reason Biden might lose in 2024, it is the border. So when you have an illegal immigrant who's angrily shouting in Spanish about how he's just learned about American squatters' rights law and how he and his friends intend to start stealing property, it's no surprise to me that people would react negatively. This guy appears to be bragging, with hate in his voice and on his face, that he can simply break into your country and take from you with impunity. The rightoids, of course, spin this as a failure of soft progressive immigration policy. Some of them even say this is a deliberate Democrat-backed invasion. I'm personally more likely to believe the former than the latter, but rather than take any of these yahoos' word for it, let's actually look at what squatters' rights are. Squatters' rights is a colloquial name for what is formerly known as adverse possession, a concept in English common law where a person who doesn't have a legal title to a piece of property, usually land, can acquire legal ownership of that property through continuous possession or occupation of the property without the permission of its legal owner. The source of adverse possession, like so much of English common law, is tradition. Historically, if somebody possessed land for long enough, it was thought that this in itself justified acquisition of a good title. This came about for practical reasons. While English land was continually being conquered and reconquered by the various factions of the Middle Ages, keeping track of who strictly owned what was actually pretty hard, and whoever could show that they possessed the land for long enough would not have their title questioned, with long enough starting out as quite subjective. This tradition eventually became the adverse possession of English common law, and John Locke described the justification for its existence in the Second Treatise on Government. He wrote, "Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature hath placed in it. It hath by this labor something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others." This is known as the labor theory of property, sometimes the labor theory of appropriation, or of ownership or entitlement, same thing really. What Locke is saying is that in the beginning, the state of the natural world is common property, or unclaimed property. It's stuff not owned by anybody. But humans are different. We are self-owned creatures. Our bodies are our own property. Therefore, what our bodies produce is also our property. When a person mixes the labor of his body with natural material held in common, that natural material becomes his property. The example often used is, if you're wandering through a forest and pick up a rock, the rock becomes your property because you've mixed nature with labor. The rock is of nature, and you performed labor upon it by picking it up. This process removes that piece of nature from the common property of all humans, and it becomes your exclusive property. Locke's formulation of the labor theory of property was used to justify the homestead principle during the American expansion westward. If settlers could reach and develop an unclaimed plot of land, it became theirs. In much the same way, the traditional method of marking off a plot of land for exclusive use during the Middle Ages was to walk it, meaning to personally walk the perimeter of the land you were claiming, at least initially. Walls or fences or shrubs would generally come later. But the act of walking it was seen to imbue in the land your moral authority to own it. Left-leaning anarchists tend to reject Locke's view on the creation of property. The libertarian socialist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon famously coined the phrase, "property is theft," sometimes ownership is theft depending on translation. What he meant by this was that the act of taking the common property of humanity and exclusivizing it, making it the property of one specific person, was stealing from the rest of humanity. When you picked up that rock and made it your own, you stole it from the commons. To Proudhon, all property that makes up society is common property. The whole of humanity has right to it all, and the state violates the rights of people by individualizing property and enforcing an individual's right to exclusively own and enjoy their own stuff. If you hear an anarchist or a socialist talk about the evils of enclosure, they're talking about the action of creating property by mixing labor with nature. The individual encloses it, severing it from the commons. Right-leaning anarchists, meanwhile, reject Locke's proviso. Locke's proviso is the one exception he provides in the labor theory of property, the bit at the end. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. What Locke is saying here is that this ability to take common property, imbue it with labor, and turn it into private property is only valid if there is still enough unclaimed property in the commons to pull from, that your act of taking would leave enough for the next guy to take. The anarcho-capitalist Murray Rothbard rejected Locke's proviso, stating that any property taken from the commons permanently became private property unless it was explicitly abandoned back to the commons, and the property could be sold or gifted away or destroyed. The remaining amount of common property made no difference to Rothbard, who simply declared that the commons existed on a first-come, first-served basis, and when it was eventually all claimed up, that was that. Locke's labor theory of property primarily justifies the creation of private property out of unclaimed common property, but it's also used to justify the creation of private property out of other private property that has been abandoned long enough that it could be reasonably considered to have been returned to the commons. Rothbard would say that no private property ever returns to the commons without the overt express consent of its owner, and Proudhon would say that the very act of creating private property in the first place is invalid, making all property inherently common. It's for this reason that right anarchists reject the idea of adverse possession entirely, believing that property has a metaphysical, inalienable chain of owners stretching back to its creation, even if that knowledge has been lost. While left anarchists view adverse possession as returning property to its rightful state, with some even believing you have a moral obligation to infringe on the liberal sense of private property rights as much as you can. What's interesting to me is that right and left anarchists are still both anarchists, though they tend to reject each other as real anarchists. Left anarchists claim that capitalism is a system of hierarchy, where private property rights are protected from the people seeking to return that property to the commons by the state and its police force. Because right anarchists don't want to dismantle capitalism, the hierarchical system imposed by the state that keeps people as atomized individuals, they are therefore not real anarchists. Meanwhile, right anarchists claim that the people have a right to be left alone to their private affairs. Every home is a castle. Collectivization of property that the left anarchist wants has to be accomplished using the state and its police force against the individual and his private domain. Because left anarchists want to impose a collective system on free individuals using the state, they are not real anarchists. Both types of anarchists ultimately blame the state for their woes, and their writing on the state is quite similar. For example, try and figure out who wrote this caption. Was it Rothbard or Proudhon? Pause the video. Okay, it was Proudhon. But that was only obvious because Proudhon lived 100 years before Rothbard, and it shows in his writing style. They basically felt the same way about governments. But as fun as this all is, at least for me, we are way too off track for this video. Most American law is based off of English common law, and as such, there are adverse possession laws on the books, but they generally take years to kick in. It's the same with Canada, though Canada is actually in the process of moving away from adverse possession laws and towards a different system, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There are two jurisdictions in North America whose laws are based not in English common law, but French civil law, the province of Quebec and the state of Louisiana, both being former French colonies. These locations have the strictest adverse possession laws, requiring 30 years of continuous abandonment by the owner and improvement by the squatter before ownership is transferred. This is because France also generally treated the matter more strictly than Britain. The relationship between adverse possession and renting a property is also kind of nebulous. For example, a tenant who is renting a property can't claim an adverse possession right after having lived there for years, even though the landlord isn't physically there, because the landlord hasn't actually abandoned the property. His use of the property as an income property doesn't count as abandonment, though I have seen many communists online exclaim that being a landlord should be outlawed and that renters should be able to simply claim the houses they rent as their property. It's important to note that the colloquial term squatter's rights doesn't just refer to taking over legal ownership of a property after years of abandonment. It also refers to squatters who break into a property and instead insist on a landlord-tenant relationship with the owner. In this case, the squatter may abandon their claim to take ownership of the property down the road, though I'm sure if they're unscrupulous, they'll still push the claim anyway. But in return, they get the legal protections of the landlord-tenant relationship, where they cannot be evicted from the property without due cause. In practical modern-day terms, what all this means is, in areas where adverse possession laws are on the books, if a person owns property but leaves it unused for long enough, and a squatter breaks into the property, lives in it, cares for it, and improves it for long enough, it becomes the legal property of that squatter, because the original owner had left it unattended for long enough that it had rejoined the commons. That's what the illegal immigrant was shouting about in the TikTok video. And in other recent high-profile cases of squatters feuding with the owners over squatters' rights, the squatter is appealing to this process. For example, there's this story that was reported on recently, where a $1 million house in Queens had squatters in it, and the owner of the house was arrested trying to remove the squatters. It turns out, within the bounds of New York City, a squatter can actually claim squatters' rights after being in a property for only 30 days. The owner of the house was trying to sell it, but squatters broke in. She returned with some male family members and changed the locks in the house, but the men inside called the cops on her. The police arrested her because, according to them, this was now a landlord-tenant issue, even though she hadn't rented the house to them.
We met Adele Andaloro outside the home her parents left her in Flushing, Queens. She's in the process of selling it.
No, he locked it.
But she's been locked out. She claims squatters moved in on February 6 and refused to leave.
What's it like being here knowing you can't go inside of your own home?
It's enraging. It really is.
In New York, squatters have rights after 30 days.
By the time that someone does their investigation and they do their work and their job, we'll be well over the 30 days, and this man will have stolen my home. And now she's back.
Just after wrapping up our interview, a woman showed up.
What are you doing in the house? Are you renting this house? Why are you here?
She unlocked the front door, saw our cameras, and took off.
It's open. Let's go in the house. It's open.
Adele and her daughter, with the property deed in hand, went inside.
This is my furniture. These are my curtains.
She didn't just find her belongings inside.
There's a man sleeping right there. Get out of my house.
She found two men.
How long have you lived here?
I moved in about 2 days ago.
They've called the police on me, and I've called the locksmiths. I didn't come in illegally.
Less than 10 minutes after police left, and the locks were changed. The man who claims to be the one actually leasing the house shows up.
Call the police again.
With the other guy, police took off the property.
Do you see this? This guy just literally broke down my door. Broke through myself and my daughter to get in here. This guy just forced himself into my house. Yes, he did. And so did you. You broke through the front door.
The man called the police on her.
So why is it that I have to leave and he doesn't have to leave?
Because technically he can't be kicked out. We need to go to court.
They consider this a landlord-tenant issue. And by law, it has to be handled through the housing court, not with police.
If you own this house, you would not want her inside.
I don't own this.
Exactly,
Yes.
she does.
Yes, but then once again, you should know how the law works.
I do know how it works.
There's rules to the as you got to go to court and send me to civil court.
He says he signed a lease in October, but wouldn't tell us with who.
I got proof longer than that.
Show us the proof.
But who are you for me to show? I showed it to cops.
Dan with Channel 7 News. If you don't want to show it, you don't want to show it.
Proof. Come here, brother. I like that.
I would like to see it.
He didn't show me a lease.
This is a bill.
A bill for work he says he had done to the house. He didn't show police a lease either.
The police department doesn't have the lease?
No.
He's got no documentation.
Just bills.
So Adele, you're getting arrested right now?
Being arrested.
For what?
For being in my own home.
And where's your lease?
She's fighting the house. It's not her house anymore.
My deed
That's
is
what was
current
told
and
already.
legal.
Arrested for unlawful eviction.
The reason this happens is because, at least in America, property is kept track of through deeds. A deed in this context is basically just a legal document declaring that you own a piece of property. Deeds are legally binding contracts, but they are not kept track of in a centralized system by the government or anything like that. In order to prove that you legally own property, you must have a physical copy of the deed, which is why most people keep their deeds in a safe location. Squatters can apply for a deed with the General Land Office of their state if they can prove abandonment by the owner, and that they've lived in and maintained the property for the number of years required. Other countries, though, use a different system than the deed one that America inherited from the UK. The Torrens title system was created by Sir Robert Richard Torrens and first implemented in Australia in 1858. This system did away with the decentralized English common law method of ownership of land being recorded by contract, and instead established a central land registry managed by the government. In this system, it's not possession of a valid deed that determines ownership, but rather being registered as the owner in the state's database. Every plot of land in the country is cataloged and has its history recorded in this database. Since the word title historically referred to a hereditary honorific, ownership of the land was conceptualized not as a deed, but a title. Countries that have adopted the Torrens title system have also largely reduced or entirely done away with their adverse possession laws. Remember, adverse possession came about in English common law due to the inability to maintain a chain of custody of property, and it was very useful in America during colonization. But in Australia, land that was registered under the Torrens title system basically became immune to takeover by squatters because the state could definitively prove ownership in the legal system. Over time, Australian deed-based land was voluntarily added to the land registry by owners who wanted the legal protections of the system, and nowadays, most Australian land is under it. A similar process took place in Canada. Vancouver Island became the second jurisdiction in the world to adopt the Torrens title system, and it rapidly spread in popularity. Nowadays, most areas in Canada use the system, with the exception of Quebec, which uses the French system mentioned earlier, and Newfoundland, which joined Canada in 1949 after Torrens' widespread adoption, so they continue to use English common law. In Ontario, squatters' rights really only matter if the squatter started squatting on the property before the modern system took effect. The old law required the squatter to have been squatting on the property for 10 years, and most of Ontario's property was moved over in the 90s and 2000s. So, unless the squatter's been on the property since the 1980s, there's actually very little they can do to legally take property from owners here. The Torrens title system sees little use in the United States. Guam uses it, a few other states use a limited form of the system, some states have tried to use it but eventually repealed it, like Virginia, Washington, Illinois, and California. It's actually considered a broadly unpopular policy in America to bring in the Torrens title system. Lefty commie types hate it because they're broadly pro-squatters' rights. They believe housing should be decommodified, and a central land registry is a practical tool wielded against their position. Righty libertarian types are against it because, as a general rule, they don't trust centralized state power, and having the government catalog and control who owns what is something they find unacceptable. Even though a centralized land registry would probably help with the legal side of the squatting problem, I don't see the idea being adopted by the Americans anytime soon. And the squatters are taking advantage of this opportunity. It's not just our Spanish-speaking TikToker from before. There are multiple squatter influencers online right now, and they've established a handy set of tips on how to invoke squatters' rights successfully. 1. Go on real estate websites and find homes that have been on the market for extended periods with no activity. Look for homes that are not too expensive, and preferably with few neighbors around. 2. Place a for sale sign on the lawn of the home, with a burner phone number attached. If nobody calls, it's not being monitored. Alternatively, place an orange cone in the driveway, and check to see if it's been moved after a week. 3. After you break in, maintain the property. Mow the lawn, fix the things that need fixing, act as if you belong there. Make sure to blend in from the point of view of your neighbors. In fact, if a blight on the neighborhood is fixed up and you're polite to the people around you, they'll actually be happy you're there. 4. If possible, get utilities turned on with a fake lease. It prevents you from living like a hermit, and you can use it down the road in your adverse possession claim. If you're a property owner, there's also a similar set of tips out there in order to ensure this doesn't happen to your property. 1. Don't leave your property unattended for too long. Yeah, I know people go on trips and stuff, but if you've inherited a house from your recently deceased grandma or something, and it sits there for 10 years uninhabited, hours away from where you live, it is a prime target. Rent it out if you have to, but keep using it. 2. Make sure the house is secure. Don't cheap out on the locks, and have security cameras installed. 3. Have a long-term plan from your property and work toward it. If you're going to sell it, don't wait. If you're going to move into it, get moving. 4. If somebody does squat, deal with it immediately. Give them exactly 0 time to establish a legal basis for a case. It sucks that you have to do this, but this is where we are now. Squatting is complete BS, by the way, but if you own property, you need to be prepared. I know right now this conversation is being framed online as if it's simply the fault of progressives in government who hate America and hate homeowners and hate capitalism. And that's kinda true, but I hope you understand now that this is actually a more complicated problem with some history behind it, and it's not as simple as left bad. I think we can all agree that squatting needs to be made illegal, that squatters should be arrested, but solving the problem the way that other liberal capitalist democracies have solved it might require a level of government access to private information that Americans are generally uncomfortable with. In the absence of a legal solution, the only thing I can say is stay vigilant, keep an eye on your stuff, and don't let squatters establish a foothold.